Today's session, Tim, is on all about communication. And I agree with you. When we were looking at what communication involves, to pack it all in a single podcast just seemed to be overwhelming. I can't communicate that fast.
Or that much.
Yeah.
It's not just running it down the freeway. It's having 12 lanes to talk about this stuff. Yeah. And doing the research on this. It's really interesting to see, the different takes on how to communicate well. I'm fascinated by everybody's opinion in this area.
Well, and there's a lot of studied opinions that I think have a lot of merit. And I know from my research, I tend to go back to my experience. What worked, what didn't work, and then see if the experts' explanations fit my situation. But I was reminded as we were preparing for this show, and I'll give you a little vignette. I was supporting a customer, and we were working in a requirements definition session with the system integrator.
Uh-huh.
We developed this entire integration process, which just made a lot of sense. And we memorialized it in writing, which is part of our communication today. We put it in writing. We were very specific. And then a couple of months later, when we were doing the user acceptance test on this particular functionality, it was working exactly opposite to what we intended it to do. We went back to the written memorial, the written requirements definition. No, this is what we wanted to do, and this is not doing it. So finally, we called a meeting because it was a very critical piece of functionality.
Right.
We called a meeting with the analyst, and we went through it, and he said, no, that's exactly. I'm reading what we wrote. I'm looking at your results. It's exactly what we intended. And I said, how can you look at the same thing I'm looking at and get different interpretations? And then I sat back. I know this is longer vignette than I intended, but I sat back and I put myself in his chair and I reread it coming from his, and I could see how he interpreted the exact same words to mean the exact opposite thing. And it was it was a situation where I looked at that and I thought, wow, communication really is hard if it's not done well. And we thought we had done it well.
Yeah, it's not just putting your ideas into words and phrases. It's making sure that, they're getting it to the right place with the right interpretation. And we often forget that.
Yeah. So how is there a definition that you like to use when you talk about, I'm not going to talk about communication. Let's talk about effective communication. Do you have a favorite definition?
Yeah, and it all stems from that word that you chose, effective. It meets its objective. Okay, I communicate. I share information with you, and if the communication information in my head matches the communication information in your head, it gets the thing done. Now, I like this word effective because it's not just for communications. You have effective meetings, you have effective leaders, you have effective projects. Peter Drucker says it. He says effective means gets the right things done. It's not just getting things done, but gets the right things done. Now, he comes from the effective executive. It's a really short book. And for those of you who want to learn effective meetings and being an effective leader, it's a great read and it's very entertaining.
So I have a very similar definition. In order to reach the objective of the communication, my definition would go one step further, and that's it's effective when the message is sent and received accurately. I guess that's just a different way of saying that it's met its objectives.
Well, that's actually the definition of communications, isn't it?
It is, but to be I threw in the word accurately.
Yeah, there you go. And that's where we include not just sending information back and forth, but we include that acknowledgement in there too, right?
Yes. Well, and here's, so when I thought back to my opening vignette, where we absolutely sent it accurately, and I read it several times, they absolutely received it accurately from their perspective, and I understood it better when I read it from their perspective. So I think that particular situation was a fluke. It was
Well,
one of those situations that doesn't happen very often, but it taught me a lesson. And that's the part where you just were getting at, and that's the acknowledgement piece.
yeah, and what's funny is you call it a fluke, and I call it must be Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Honestly, if you look at communication, the delivery of communication can happen on multiple vectors, right?
Yeah.
I can write it down. I can say it orally. I write it down to make a permanent record, and also to manage versioning, right? It's
Yes.
a way to manage controlled changes of the communication. It can also be informal and formal, and that's the problem. Formal means it's clearly understood. Now,
Yes.
what we think a lot of times is writing things down makes it easy to understand. It's not the writing down that makes it understand. It's the effort in formalizing it. It's making it clear and understandable. So this is where you get into the realm of see me emails, right? Your director says, see me. Oh, are you going to fire me, or are you going to give me a promotion? And this is poor communications because it's informal. There's a lot of inference involved, and bouncing around in your head, it makes a lot of sense. But when you send it to others, all of a sudden they have other things going on that they're thinking about. And we have to be very careful in the way we structure our communications, or we can easily be misread.
Oh, so easily. And I'm working right now with a client, advising them and kind of coaching them on user acceptance testing and how to go about it, and how to report on defects and those sorts of things. It's amazing to me that even very senior people, when they get into the accuracy of the reporting, they ramble. And so even I'm in the depths of this process, and I understand what they're trying to say, and I want to interrupt and speak for them, but I can't because they have to learn this. But the rambling is confusing, and it confuses the message receiver, who happens to be the system integrator who needs to fix the defects. So
this is beautiful. This is beautiful. You know who that reminds me of? Richard Feynman. A lot of he was a noted physicist. When the scientists researching nuclear devices post World War II were doing it, Feynman was the youngest physicist on the team, and he went on to be a scientist in Berkeley, I think. I forget, but a lot of his students said, "How come you're able to say things so clearly where other professors make it useless?" And he says, "Well, every time I say something and somebody says, I don't know this, I put a star by it. And then I change the way I say it until it makes total sense to them." This is called the Feynman technique, by the way. And it's clarifying that concept. And when people are using two words, Feynman said, too many words means I don't understand it myself. I can't explain it to myself. So I do a little pirouette around the concept with many, many words.
Well, and maybe that's the example I use with people who are rambling, trying to explain a defect. That could be that they don't understand enough about what they just saw.
Exactly.
To be able to put it into writing or into perspective.
Exactly. So, yeah. They're solving, and people who are doing that, they're actually taking the problem outside of their head and they're solving it in front of you. And that's beautiful because it's not an obstacle. It's actually telling you what's going on. It gives you an opportunity to help them pull back to the big picture and give them a little more context. And even though you're not an expert, you can actually facilitate problem solving really effectively with this.
And what people don't understand in those situations is that fewer words are better words.
Oh yes, oh yes. It's like, how was dinner?
Yeah.
I don't want to hear about the 12 herbs that you tasted in the food. Did you like it or not? Right.
Yeah.
And that's what we mean by effective. Meets its objective, gets
Well,
the right things done.
but you had mentioned something about people think that if they write it down, it's accurate. And I think I want to get into some of the written communication. But I started going down the path when you were saying that. And I think it was Mark Twain who said this when he was asked to give a presentation, or in this case, write a letter. He said, how long do I have to, for example, I'll use oral communication. How long do I have? If you're saying I have to speak for 2 hours, I can do it right now. But if you say I have to speak for 5 minutes, I need 2 weeks to prepare. So I paraphrase that. That's not inaccurate, but the concept of that particular statement is incredibly powerful.
Oh yes, and it's incredibly true.
Yeah.
I don't want to derail where we're going with this, because this is exciting, but this is the problem I faced when the exam changed, the PMP exam, when it changed in 2021. PMI took about 20 to 30% of the material out of the exam because they went to the 7th edition. And then they added 100% more in Agile. And so here I was having to talk about all of these things within the same 35 hours. And communication is like, okay, prioritize. And within that prioritization, how can I say something in the shortest way, in the most effective manner? And it has taken me months with some of these concepts to get them so precise that I can lay it out in front of you in 15 minutes and you say, got it. And this is something that takes so much effort.
Well, it does. I remember asking someone how long they'd been speaking, because they just come off a stage. And I said, how long have you been speaking? And he goes, since I was 2. Well, that's a great answer, except part of, and I wasn't going to give him a critique, but part of what I was trying to get to was his on-stage presentation was so abysmal. I really tried to think, how on earth does this person get paid for what he's doing? Because he clearly had not practiced his craft and his message had not come through very clearly. So
yeah, it really is amazing. So here we go, right? We're talking about effective. Now, we're talking about communications here. What's your go-to statement when you're telling someone how serious you are about good communications? Like you're in a project kickoff and you're saying, this is how we need to communicate.
I think that's a good question. I mean, my focus statement in generic or general conversation tends to be something along the lines of, so let's stop and let's focus on this, because this is important to our client, or this is important to our leadership. So if I'm doing a project kickoff, I guess there's a lot of generic items that we cover in a kickoff, and I would probably say something along the lines of, okay, now let's pay attention really carefully here, and I want your feedback as I approach this next subject. So it's just a matter of saying stop, listen, and provide feedback. I think that's probably my go-to statement.
So what you're saying is the statement is not, this is what good communications are, and this is what we need. What your statement is, let me teach you and lead you so you can experience good communications.
Yeah.
And that's the first statement you have about communications. It's an engaging activity, and I want us to actually work on the various skills that comprise it.
Yeah. And you know what's interesting? I started a UAT meeting. We've been going 7-8 hours a day for the last several days. When I say, people go, oh, 7-8 hours, that's not a big deal. Well, it is if you're remote and you're being very intentional, very intense about this particular task. So by the time you get to the 5th day of the week, people are tired. And our meeting this morning started with a little frivolity. And it's interesting. Typically, I would not allow a lot of that because it takes away from the focus. But it just helped so much to get people in a better mood. And then the communication happened. So there's different ways of approaching this in terms of the go-to statements or the go-to interaction just to get things started. I think there's different things, and you have to kind of learn how to keep your antenna up as to what will work in this situation at this time.
Very good. Very good. So let's continue in this manner.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about oral communications here, what are good rules to follow just in general?
In oral communication? Well, let me go back to the rambling experience that we just had. I think the idea is to stop, think it through, and you can do this in a matter of a couple of seconds. Think it through and begin at a logical place. Don't just begin where your mind tells you to start. Really think in terms of who is receiving your message and begin with that logical starting place. And then that will help you avoid the going around in circles as you try to describe what it is that you need to communicate. I think I've shared, let me just take 1 second more. I think I've shared this with you in the past. I worked for a vice president once, and I was on a project, and we'd get into these executive leadership meetings that dealt with the project situation. And he'd be asked a question, and he would literally pause, I think, for a count of 5. And I would get nervous as his underling. I would think, are you not understanding the question that you're taking so long? But what was interesting, he would pause for that few seconds, and then what came out of his mouth was pure, logical, hang on every word statements.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Active listening is the participation in the process of listening. It's not thinking while people are talking.
Oh yeah, that's huge.
And this is a big part of communication. And these pauses, number one, if you're the one sharing information, a pause allows the receiver to think. Second of all, if you're the receiver, a pause before you speak allows you to organize your thoughts. It allows you to engage the front part of your brain before you start putting out the word and sentence salad.
Well, and it also allows you to understand your audience. There's things that you may say that are appropriate in this situation, but not in this one. And so sometimes, and I've learned also to take that pause and in my mind say, I can't say that. Not to this audience. I can't say that. I want to say that. I can't say that. So it gives you that ability also to just be circumspect in your speaking.
And in oral communications, there's another channel that's going on simultaneously, which is the body language. Yeah. And with those pauses, it gives you an opportunity to check the body language and say, okay, am I confusing people here? Are people really listening to me? And it allows you to validate at least the transmission of your information, if not the acknowledgement.
Well, and the other thing that I think our audience needs to understand, and I say needs to as opposed to wants to, is that if there is a pause in the conversation because someone is not quite ready to give their response, that is not an opportunity for you to fill the space. Keep the pause going. Let that person think through and offer. I have been in so many situations where you end up pausing, thinking, responding in a very effective manner, but someone thinks, oh, he didn't understand my question. And so they repeat it in another way. And it's like, now you've just interrupted my train of thought.
You're giving away all my secrets. Western civilization has a bad habit. Our culture thinks that if we don't fill up spaces with words, it's not a meaningful conversation.
Right.
However, if you study music, the pauses are almost as important as the music itself. And it's the combination of two that makes great music, right?
Yeah.
And I learned this in the interpretation of classical music, right? I took that with me into business, and I said, what happens if I pause? Well, if I'm interviewing a stakeholder, guess what? They're going to give me a bunch of word and sentence salad because they're going to get nervous, and
Yeah.
they're going to give me more information than I would have asked for. And
Right.
I'm saying things like, isn't that interesting? Okay, let me jot that down. I'm going to have a lot more questions.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful technique. Get comfortable with pauses in the conversation.
Yeah.
And number one, it gives you a chance to read what's going on, actively listening, but at the same time, give others an opportunity to process and share.
So that probably is the same side of the coin that I tried to explain. So when you purposely pause after you ask your question, you want them to fill it in. You don't want to, just because they or in your pause, if they're also pausing in their response, you don't want to necessarily interrupt their pause. You want them to come back and come back and come back with more material.
And think about effective communication, getting the right things done. If you're interviewing a client, it's not your job to tell the client things. It's the client's job to tell you things.
Yeah.
And if you're stepping over the words of the client, you're not effective.
Yeah. But it's interesting. You also said body language. There's a lot of time. Well, I have learned over the years in a situation, especially if there's more than one person communicating, if it's not me actively communicating, I'm watching how the other people are responding to each other, not just in their words, but in their facial expressions, in the way they interact with their bodies. You know, sometimes they'll close up or whatever it is that they happen to do. I can also interpret extra meaning in how they're receiving the message or how they're imparting the message just by watching their facial features or their body work.
And I've made a history of studying these micro movements. This was a big deal about 7 or 8 years ago. There are little adjustments to our body language, especially around the face, that we make. And if you're aware of them, they help you interpret things. Like somebody smiling, well, it's a special type of smile, and they're really being a little bit salty, right?
Yeah.
Or they're saying something, but their face is saying, I'm covering my tracks, or I'm putting on a mask, or something else.
Yeah.
And so looking for these things, and body language all of a sudden is not limited to face-to-face conversation.
Yeah.
These micro movements that we have in our faces allow us to, number one, even over WebEx and Zoom, we can actually track these things carefully. Number two, we can actually use them for pretty accurate interpretation.
Oh yeah, I've been in situation, for example, where the other person is more hostile. Well, no, let me put it this way: they are caught in a shall we say, an untruth, and they don't know that they've been caught. But as they explain themselves, two things can happen that I've noticed. One is they won't give you eye contact; they'll shift around as they explain, or they'll give you a deep eye contact, almost like a arrogant stare or a defiant stare. Both of those can give you a clue that they're not quite owning up to what just happened. And you know, just sometimes it's almost imperceptible, but you can figure it out just by practice.
You know, this comes down to authenticity and integrity.
Yeah.
When we think about integrity, we think about our actions and our words saying the same thing. Well, our body language is just another channel for our actions. They're basically our subconscious giving away all of our hidden thoughts. And if we get really good at this, It can be scary. And again, it's a force for good or evil, of course, but at the same time, it's a huge amount of information. And this is one way that we can also represent ourselves as more authentic.
Yeah.
Where we understand and we watch our body language and we watch what happens when we're ashamed in public, and we feel what we feel and we try to capture what's going on in our bodies.
I've watched political debates, for example, where someone is giving a response to the person who asked the question in a very positive vibe, hoping that the people who are out there voting will vote in the affirmative for them. And while they're giving the response, they're shaking their head no. And I don't even know if they realize it. But I think their body is telling them, you're not going to keep this promise. And yet they're making these statements that make it sound like they are. So it's, and by the way, that's not just related to politics. I've seen that in other settings as well.
Yeah, it's and you have to be careful, because sometimes that's no, I disagree, or no, I'm confused.
Right.
And
right.
we have to be really careful in these type of confusions. And this is why active listening is so important, and acknowledgement is so important. When we get these no's in the body, we can't just take them as no's what we think they are. We have to dig further and figure out what's the root cause of that no. And so I can actually understand it appropriately.
And the other thing I'd like to bring up, and I'd like to get on to written communication here shortly, but another thing I'd like to bring up about oral communication, particularly in more formal settings, I get frustrated by even some of my colleagues who, when something is going on in the meeting, they just spout. Whatever, without knowledge or facts, or they just spout. And sometimes it throws the conversation or the discussion off. I remember being challenged one time by a member of, actually by one of my clients after a meeting, saying, what you just said in there, how do you know? I mean, why would you have said that? And I just responded, I said, I do not open my mouth in a meeting and make a statement unless I've researched it and understood it to be true before I make the statement. And I think I just learned that over the years, that for me to speak in a discussion, I have to have my homework completed and accurate.
I learned this from a younger PM than me. He actually said, in all of his kickoffs, he said, we are totally confused when we define words differently. So we're going to define things, and we're going to agree on these definitions. And one of the sets of definitions that he always brought up in a kickoff is, this is an opinion, this is a fact, this is how they're different, and this is how they're both useful. And it's like, oh, and it sort of sets the expectation that says, when Merv says something, he's saying fact. And when George says something over there, that's an opinion. It doesn't mean that George is wrong. It means that George has something he believes deeply in, where Merv has done some incredible research to say that in public.
Yeah, and what you just said is also very strong statement as well, because if I don't know, I will either say I don't know, or I will say in my opinion. And then that way people know that, you know, that there's something else going on. But this business of just spouting because you want to say something, I've had people, in fact, this week, I've had people offer observations about user acceptance testing, and they haven't even been in the room.
Yes.
It just frustrates me to no end. But anyway.
Yeah, and the thing is, we think that we have to train people to do tasks. We have to train people to communicate and what good communication means.
Yeah.
Let's move on. You want to talk about written communication, right?
I do, and I want to talk about it in a couple veins, or at least I do. I don't know, you might have some other ideas, but I think let's start off with project communications, and maybe something that we can even put into our team handbook, or our what do we call that? The
team charter.
Team charter, yeah, something that we can put in there so that we as a team are consistent and accurate in our communications for the entire project duration. Do you have some ideas around that?
Yes. First of all, just general communications. We're going to acknowledge. Acknowledgement does not mean I'm questioning you. Acknowledgement means that I'm receiving confirmation that you have information and you know what to do with it. So if I ask you, it's not a challenge. It's a validation. It's telling me, the project manager, I don't have to figure out another way to say something. That's part of the team charter. Acknowledgement, acknowledgement, acknowledgement.
Oh, so and even I think you've used this example before. Even how we settle disputes or how we come to an agreement on something, we can write that consistently and concisely in the team charter, so that we're always very, very professional in our communication.
Right, and practice, and finding opportunities to practice this, and committing as a team. We're going to practice these things so that when it gets really heated in the room, we do it right. You're going to be with somebody for 1.5 to 2 years. You're going to get into a lot of arguments. And so we have to have a way to navigate these emotions and get to the real core of the problem quickly.
Yeah, and the other thing I find, and this is probably not so much in the team charter as it is in the project charter, but the other thing that I find is that, for example, if my primary way of communicating to my client is to get it in writing, put it in writing and get them to review and receive it. So why not have a set of consistent templates for whatever type of formal written communication you're providing to your client, so that when they receive it, it's always in the same format. They can always see how their review responses are handled. It's very consistent, very upfront, very easy to navigate in terms of understanding and responding.
Oh yeah. Think about an email, right? It's the same thing. Humans are creatures of habit, because habit actually is a survival mechanism, right? It's a learned behavior that's automatic, that keeps me away from trouble. Well, we actually learned this in email, right? Here's where it's from. Here's the subject. That's the item that I need to know about this email. And then here's the body. And then here's the signature. And here's how I contact them, right? And I know automatically to go to that. So as a template, this is critical. Now, it's even more critical when we get into these really complicated documents. Here's the index. Here's the source content. Here's the reference material, and so on and so forth. And it goes on down and down. Here's the naming convention of documents, right? We've gotten into that in the versioning. All of that, and what you're doing with this format across all templates, Merv, is making it really easy for people to share information.
Yeah, I just love it. The project I'm on right now, we've been advising our client for over a year, and they brought on some new people, and they said, you know what, I have this document from another project. Let me introduce this document. It's like, we're a year into this project. We've already got our processes set up. We don't want your document from the other project.
It's really hard to navigate those. And it really is hard to bring people in mid-project when things are formal, because you don't want to snuff out that, that altruistic optimism they have, but at the same time, you have to communicate that sometimes this is helpful and it's great advice.
The other thing I do in the written communication, especially up front, is I'll go to the client themselves and say, what are your standards for communication? And it's interesting, but I've had to teach my own team to follow things like the order of, if you're writing an email and you have several people in the email, the order of the people in how they're referenced is very important to some clients. the way you put their title next to their name is very important to some clients. And it's amazing to me how, people just go, oh, well, let me throw something. It goes to George and to Jeff and so they end up with all kinds of different mishmash, and they offend the client and don't realize that they did it.
Yeah. And the problem is some workers and even a few first line managers may not pick up on this, but executives do. Those are the type of details that executives look for.
And for young project managers, those are the types of details that can hurt you right up front, or they can help you if you're paying attention.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So actually, the project management body of knowledge gives us guidance on how to write effective communication too. It's over there. And for those of you curious, just ask in the comments, and I can cite page number. But it's really interesting what they highlight. They call it the 5 C's. Now, this is a common model that's taught at every university, but it's funny that Project Management Institute introduced this into the process model and say, this is important for us too. We all know how to write. No, we don't. I was writing proposals for Fortune 50s, Fortune 100s, guys who are making 8 or 9 figures a year. And so I had to go back to my high school and middle school education and think, what were the teachers telling me? And they have it spelled out very clearly. I'm going to go through it really quickly, and you can have comments for this, right?
Sure.
Number 1, grammar and spelling. Okay,
oh my goodness.
So I have seen this in my classes. If I have a PowerPoint up and I've misspelled a word on the 3rd bullet, everybody's going to think about that misspell and they're going to miss the message.
Yep.
That's an easy one, but we have to take time. Concise expression and elimination of excess words. That's your word salad that we were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah. The ramblers. Yep. Absolutely.
Clear purpose and expression directed to the needs of the reader. And this is so common. If I don't know why I'm reading this email, what am I going to do with it?
Or how about the email that has a very specific subject line and 14 topics within it that have nothing to do? Or maybe the first one deals with the subject line, but the other 13 don't. And then you're going back to try to find the email that had a specific item in it, and you can't find it because it's messed up in this body of this. Anyway, that fits very well there.
Oh, that's purpose. That's beautiful. Coherent, logical flow of ideas. Okay, jumping from thought to thought to thought is fun. And in poetry and in some prose, it's very artistic. But we have to be slowly and methodically building up a case or leading people to a conclusion we desire. Or if we don't do that effectively, they're not going to get there.
Well, and I mentioned earlier when we were discussing part of something like this, I said, begin at a logical point and then take your argument from there, or your explanation from there. Logical point does not necessarily or always mean start at the beginning.
Right. The last one of the 5 C's is controlling flow of words and ideas. One of the biggest things I had a problem with was I tend to think in an integrated manner. So I'd have 2 or 3 sentences that were highly technical and 2 or 3 sentences that were strategic. And I'd go back to that and say, what was I trying to do here? And so I've learned over the years to say, okay, this is the technical part and it's over here. And dear reader, here's the strategy part. And here's the strategy here. And by the way, this 3rd paragraph says, this is how they support each other and work together.
Oh, that's beautiful. That works great. I just experienced a situation where we're knee deep into solving a problem and the conversation is like that. And then one of the participants throws something else in because it happened to hit her at the point that had something to do with this, but really not. It just something that stirred. And the system integrator in this, the analyst in this particular situation, just looked at her and said, okay, let's hold that thought for now, but let's finish this. And I thought that was just a really nice way of saying my logical progression in that, what that last C was, my logical
controlling flow of ideas.
Yeah, my logical progression is here. I value what you just asked for. We will get to that, but let's finish this, because otherwise you're right. It's word salad, it's jumbled, it's all over the place, and you never get anywhere.
And you're respectful and you recognize the contributions and the people involved. There's no better way to do that.
Right. You know, going back to the grammar and the misspelling, there are so many hints, even as you write a Word document or even an email. Misspellings are pointed out to you. There's even grammatical hints provided. Stop and just think through what it is that you're saying. Because when I read something that is grammatically incorrect or spelling mistakes, I'm thinking, you don't care. You're sloppy in your conversation. How is the product you're delivering to me? Is that any more accurate, or is it just as sloppy as your communication? So it does reflect on you as a professional in what you're doing for me.
I learned how to use email to do this well too. Before I even put the person I'm emailing in that to window, I write the email. So I cannot send it until I've done that formal review, especially if people are 2, 3, or even 5 ranks ahead of me. I am that careful because I've done that. Oops. I've sent those CMEs enough times to confuse executives.
Well, and the other thing and I still do this today, even in informal communication, email is so germane to what we do, including, by the way, texting and instant messaging, but it's such a part of what we do that it is so important. What I find is I use the term, write it once, review it several times. And it's amazing how many times you can kind of condense it and get it to the point where now it logically makes sense. And the first thing I do, the very first thing I do is my first line states the conclusion of the email, where I want people to go. And then I fill in the justification for what I'm looking for. I don't like going through 14 paragraphs of an email and then at the very end saying, okay, this is what we need to do. Give me that right up front, and then I'll look for the hints through the email so that I can help you.
Exactly. Because an executive doesn't want the details. The executive says, okay, what are you going to do? What's the answer to my question? And that should be the purpose of the email. That's what we mean by clear purpose and expression directed to the needs of the reader.
By the way, that little trick you just helped us with the don't put the person in the to until you finish the email. It also goes for the CC. How many times have people done a reply all and realized this was internal, but there were some external people on the CC that are sort of buried and I didn't look for them. And suddenly I've got egg in my face because I just spilled something I shouldn't have to someone else who is not my intended audience.
Right. It's this, email is wonderful, but number one, it's instantaneous, and number two, it's permanent. And because of that, I agree with you wholly. Send it once, review it multiple times.
Right. Yeah. And I'm going to ask you this too. Have you had those emails where they come and they're like 14 deep? And by the time you go down and you say, how did we get here? And then and I've had this happen to me. You get down to the bottom and you go, oh, the starting point of this email was never intended for me, but someone along the way kept doing a forward or reply all, attaching everything. So by the time it got to me, I got to read stuff that I wasn't supposed to see.
So I learned, this is something else I learned in corporate life. I learned to write an email that says, here's the subject, and was colon the other email. This is really important in these days where Microsoft thinks they're so helpful in creating this threading. It can put you at risk if you're not really conscious of what these tools are doing.
Yeah. What about what grade level roughly would you write an email to, even if it's to a formal executive email?
Well, again, the university level, entry level is about what we call 8th grade in the United States. And that's what? 8 plus 6, that's 14 years old. It's somebody who's in the transition from a middle teenager to becoming a young adult. It's somebody who can actually follow a logical progression across 3 to 5 paragraphs. And that's what I'm looking at. And second of all, it's something I can say with 5 bullets.
Yeah.
It's just like writing a good PowerPoint slide. If I can put 5 bullets, and then number 1, I just share those bullets, and I can understand it and people can understand it. And I have context if people ask about those bullets. I'm now communicating effectively.
Absolutely. I also would think about the 8th grade level, and lest our audience think that we're being condescending to those whom we're writing the emails to, I don't think that's it. First of all, if you write at about the 8th grade level, it's a way of keeping things fairly simple as well, because you use complicated sentence structures and big words and all that stuff. You can end up confusing your message just because you've complicated it too much. So a lot of times when I'll write at the 8th grade level, it's not for my audience, it's for me. Because if I can write at that level, if I can explain it to an 8th grader, then I really understand what I'm talking about.
There you go. There you go. And let's put it in a different context too. I'm speaking to 5 different cultures, and they come from 10 different languages, and English is only one.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is not condescending, people. This is business critical to make sure you're expressing it at a level that the common newspaper or website is communicating.
No, that is so important. Communicate, and it goes back to that effective communication, so that your message is not only given, but it's also received accurately.
Right. There's one other thing. There's one other thing that we need to talk about with communication. We have acknowledgement, but one of the things that we haven't talked about today is noise. How do you look at noise, and how do you look at managing noise? What's a good definition for noise for you in communication?
I think noise is anything that distracts me from either delivering or distracts you from receiving the message. And when I say noise, it could be something as silly as the body language I'm employing as I deliver. I could be offering noise in that. It could be physical noise if you have people in the same room who are having side conversations. So I think there's different ways of kind of this talking about noise and how it affects communication.
Think about this. It's getting in the way of reception, and it's getting in the way of decoding the message.
Yeah.
How about the noise that's going on inside of the receiver's head?
Oh my goodness, yes.
I'm hungry. When is lunch? I have a headache. My dog is sick. I only have a quarter tank or let me multitask. And that's noise. But the problem is it's human nature. This is
Or
how humans function.
I'll give you the worst one. In my mind, I know what you're going to say when you respond to me, so I'm already formulating my response. Therefore,
Yeah.
I'm not really picking up what you're giving. I'm not really picking up what you're laying down, but I'm already going to respond.
Yeah, it's I'm picking a fight before you're starting it. It's interesting. These whole aspects in communication are so much a part of human behavior, and they're at the very least they're influenced by human behavior. So if we want to be technically accurate in communicating, we have to understand the human influences and the human characteristics behind communication.
Yeah, I recently was speaking to a retired military commander, and he said that he'd get into a comfortable position and he'd sit back in his chair and he'd fold his arms and he'd kind of have his conversation with his lieutenants. And he found out after a few of these that his lieutenants thought, because of his posture, that he wasn't caring about what they were saying. So he learned, in this case, noise. He learned that that was a noise that he was offering. He didn't intend it to. He was just being comfortable. He was involved in the conversation. He was enjoying the conversation. A lot of information was being handled, but he was throwing his lieutenants off because they thought that he didn't care.
And this was, what you're showing is an example of understanding the variations of communication getting in the way. For instance, I solve my problems inside of my head. I'm an introvert, right? Extroverts tend to get the problem out on the table and they solve the problem in a collaborative manner, right? Let's work together on this. Here's my problem. La, 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 la. And introverts are the ones who are saying, let me figure this out and let me get my hands around it. And I'm going to share some stuff with you. And understanding the character traits of the people in the room and the people you're communicating with is critical in understanding effective communications.
Well, go back to your developer days. The program that you are developing is just not working for some reason, and you're trying to figure it out, and finally you call one of your colleagues over and says, help me with this, look at this. And as you explain it out loud, the problem is solved.
Yeah, it's magic. And as an IT developer, it's not just writing code, but it's general problem solving. We've done this in data center design often. We'd, after dinner, over dessert, when we were relaxed and more comfortable, it seems that in the heat of the moment, you're tense. It seems that the ideas don't flow as much, but we always laughed about having dessert and solving problems at the restaurant, but there's a natural reason for that. And to actually understand this is the way humans work is a real benefit to managing communications.
Or that famous 4-word line, let's sleep on it.
Yes.
So how do you acknowledge to the person communicating to you that you have heard? How do you personally do that?
It's called active listening.
Yeah.
Number one, it's repeating the information shared for validation. Did I get this right? This is what I heard. This is what I think. And second of all, it's engaging. It's leaning into the conversation. You'll often see me do this with the camera in our shows. When I'm leaning in, I'm not just interested and curious, but sometimes I'm actually communicating. I acknowledge that what you're saying is really important, and I want to represent this with my body language. And finally, it's the giving pause.
Yeah. What's that old saying? God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in proportion.
Yeah, it's those are the ways that I actually demonstrate acknowledgement, though, and demonstrate that I'm participating in the communication.
Yeah. And I want to also, I'm going to add one too, is that if you go back to our conversations on body language, I think your body language, while this part of this is the active listening that you just spoke about, but things like head nods, smiles, quizzical looks, something that you can offer, even in the way, as you mentioned, you lean forward into the camera when you're having a one-on-one, or if you're in a meeting, leaning forward into trying to pick up more of what they're saying, just in showing that interest. I think all of that is so evident of your receiving and acknowledging the message that you are receiving.
Exactly. It sounds trite. It sounds silly, but you know
Yeah.
what? I have said, yeah, it's silly and it's incredibly effective.
Well, we're going to be speaking about meetings one of these upcoming shows, but one of the other things, I'm just going to throw this out as we finish off today, but one of the other things I've learned in conversation, particularly when we've had several people in the meeting, is to summarize the meeting at the end. Go over action items, go over things like decisions that you made, just so that you kind of clarify. So always leave a few minutes at the end, go through what it is to remind people, get it out in writing, but just a great way of saying, I've received what you said and I'm repeating it back to you in this summary format.
Yeah, let's talk about meetings because they are a special criteria of communication that I think could consume at least 1 hour. And what you're talking about is what I've talked about with effective communication. Tell them what you're going to say what you say, and tell them what you said. Leave no room for confusion or doubt.
Exactly. Or ambiguity or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think this has been great. We're going to wrap it up at this point. And if I'm going to get hold of you this week, how am I going to do that in the most effective, communicative way?
For the public, general public, LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with me or ask me questions, I'm there. How about you, Merv?
Same, LinkedIn, or also communicate through my through looking at my website. There's some free giveaways there as well. So just get hold of us however you can. Leave comments at the end of this show. Just do whatever you can if you've got questions or responses to what we've said, or even if you disagree with something. We love to have people disagree with us so that we can come back with a more informed opinion, perhaps, or just correct ourselves. So feel free to do that as well.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Merv. And thanks for everybody checking in. And we're looking forward to our next show, indeed.